Hey, deserving listeners, I thought I would respond to some of the patron emails. By the way, I think I haven't said this in a long time, but if you become a patron, you don't have to listen to any ads. I don't know if people know that, so just thought I'd mention that. Also, you literally pay my bills so I can do all this stuff. And there's always people who are dropping off, so if you are on the fence, it'd be nice. Okay, annual long-term patron Layla from Canada, she says, "Hey, Kirk, I love your episodes about professional misconduct." And then Layla gives me this information about a Canadian psychologist that was disciplined, and I looked it up from her links there, and I am now going to tell you the summary. I couldn't find more specific information, but there's enough here for us to give this at least 3 yikes. So the psychologist's name, Tatiana Zdyb, I think you pronounce it. The last name is ZD. So Zdyb, based in London, Ontario. She had her license revoked by the licensing board for multiple professional violations. Let's get into the specific allegations and findings by the licensing board in Canada. That she violated the ethical code of not having sex with your clients. It's a weird way to put it. Sexual misconduct. She admitted to having a sexual relationship with a client. She also admitted to having, or she was found to have violated the standard of care regarding boundaries of various sorts with various clients, including having intimate friendships with some clients. So that's one. The second, and that's all that you need, right? But another finding was that she was providing services outside her scope of expertise. You know, usually in our field of psychotherapy, we're thinking about, well, you're not really an expert in trauma, so you shouldn't have been advertising yourself as such, or you have someone that's working with kids that doesn't have any training in that. No, not in this case. In this case, she was prescribing ketamine and psilocybin even though she was not a medical prescriber. And that was just with one case. So God knows what else she was doing. And then the third finding was that she was misrepresenting her credentials. I'm not exactly sure what that entailed, but I'm guessing it had to do with the medical prescribing. I'm not sure. The licensing board decided, they said publicly that her conduct was a matter of profound concern, and therefore they revoked her license indefinitely and said that she can apply for reinstatement after a 5-year period, which I'm guessing she would be denied, but maybe not. Maybe if she goes through tremendous training and can demonstrate repentance and learning new skills that she may not have ever known, then maybe they would give her license. I don't know. But this is nice to hear, and Layla, thanks for sending this in, because so often licensing boards in North America go too easy on people, and this is an example where they did what I would hope they would do, which is take away a license. You know, we need more clinicians, but regardless, we don't need clinicians like this out there. And as I always say, what do I say? where there's a fart, there's a shart or something, or where there's smoke, there's fire, or the tip of the iceberg. In that, when you have one ethical violation, particularly if it's egregious, you will find others almost all the time. I wouldn't be surprised if there were dozens, if not hundreds, of examples from dozens or hundreds of clients. Usually it's just the few who come forward and the few who are looked into by the licensing board. And because even with those few, we see across the board, having sex with clients, having friendships with clients, prescribing even though you're not a prescriber. So yikes. Okay, let's go on to another email. All right, this next email is from patron Jillian from New Hampshire. She says, "I'm a huge fan of the podcast and everything you do. Discovering your channel 2 years ago has changed my life tremendously." Just chiming in here. Well, patron Jillian, that's really, really nice to hear. Going on, "I had a self-realization of sorts the other day and was curious about what you think. I realized that I just don't miss people ever. I don't miss people. I love my family and friends dearly and would be devastated to lose any of them, and I have struggled with severe grief surrounding this. I love my friends and family. I would be devastated to lose any of them, and I have struggled with severe grief surrounding this, meaning that if one of your close individuals were to die or break up with you or something, you've experienced severe grief. Okay, so all that's looking pretty normal. But I just don't miss people, regardless of how much time I spend away from them. When people ask if I miss them, I've always said yes, even though that's not how I feel. I know it wouldn't hurt their feelings, and if it were the other way around, I would feel hurt to learn someone didn't miss me when I was gone. Okay. All right, well, you laid it out pretty well, patron Jillian, that you know that you love your family and friends. You know that you would be devastated if you lost them. But when they say that they miss you after a period of time, you will reciprocate and say, oh, I missed you too, or I miss you too, and even though you don't miss them. Okay. And you're wondering, and your main question at the top of the email in the subject line was, why don't I miss people? Well, it's possible that your attachment needs are being fulfilled enough and that you actually just aren't missing anybody. It's also possible that it's just something that people say when they haven't seen you in a while and no one is really missing each other and you're just the only one that is willing to think that thought. It's also possibly that you're avoidantly attached, which I can't know, but that would be a factor, right? That you're pathologically independent, you're afraid to be dependent, and you're somewhat cut off from your emotions, but not enough to be entirely avoidant, meaning that you do notice your feelings when you lose someone, right? So you could be kind of avoidantly attached. If you went on TikTok, everyone would say you're autistic or ADHD or something, and maybe, but or an introvert, which isn't this actually. Introversion is entirely different. It's not being a loner. But there's a possibility that there's some neurodivergence or some personality trait that's at play. But and also it depends on the degree. Like maybe other people, when they say they miss someone, it's not like they're deeply missing other people, but they just, when they see someone, they're like, it's great seeing you, and maybe we should see each other more. But when they really sit down and think about it, they're not like constantly missing you the way they're kind of portraying it. And maybe you're just, feeling that. And when they say missing, you're just not like, you're feeling like, I don't really miss you. So, yeah, that's my answer to that. Let's take a break. All right, back from the break. This next email is from an anonymous listener. She says, why do I feel uneasy, nervous, and scared when things are going good in life? Why do I feel scared when things are going good in life? The feeling of, oh no, something bad is going to happen when I feel happy and content and seeing the good side of things. End of email. Yeah, this is a well understood trauma reactivity or personal bias. In schema therapy, they describe it well as one of the 18 schemas. I think it's called pessimism schema. And it involves having internalized a worldview early in life that emphasizes threats and catastrophe and possibly failure. Essentially, what is happening is that the child is repeatedly surprised or being blasted with the reality that catastrophes are around every corner. And the self, as a way of coping with this very difficult situation, will say, you know what, let's just assume that catastrophes are going to happen so that at the very least, we're not taken by surprise. So then the individual grows up, moves out of the catastrophe situation, and feels a constant threat of catastrophe around every corner. My dogs are barking. I don't know if you could hear them. And it's very distressing, right? Because when things aren't going well, things suck. But when things are going well, it still sucks because you assume that catastrophe is around every corner, and you have increasing anxiety. And sometimes this can cause a self-fulfilling prophecy where people will, out of their anxiety or just as a way of getting getting it over with, they will self-sabotage, right? Because there's nothing worse than anticipatory anxiety, just waiting, and it's just like, oh my God, what's it going to be? When's it going to happen? And consciously or unconsciously, sometimes people will self-sabotage and create a catastrophe, so at least they can control when and how it happens, that kind of stuff. But at the very least, it creates what you're talking about, which is unease, nervousness, and fear when things are going good in life. And it's hard to combat because I've worked with people with this schema, and it sounds pretty easy to combat. You just say, oh, I see. I have this very common schema that a lot of people have when they grow up in a certain environment. But that's half the battle. The other half is actually ridding oneself, because when something feels right, it just feels right that a catastrophe is around the corner, the self will invent reasons to believe. It's like, well, the political situation, or Donald Trump tweeted this thing, or someone, my dad isn't taking care of himself or something. Now, this isn't to say that these bad things aren't going to happen or that there isn't a threat out there at times, but the pattern is there. You will see a pattern. And if people are self-aware, they'll see it in themselves, that no matter what is going on in life or in the world, they will always have this sense, and they're quite convinced that a catastrophe is just around the corner. So it can be really hard to combat this. I've worked with clients in therapy, and we'll have these debates, and I try not to get in a power struggle with these clients, but it's hard. It's easier said than done. Okay, next email. All right, this next email is from annual patron Joe. She says, do you have a podcast episode that talks about mentalization-based therapy, and do you practice it? End of email. The answer to that is I do not, from my memory, pretty sure, 99% sure, I don't have an episode on mentalization-based therapy. I have talked about mentalization a lot because it's bread and butter when it comes to treating people with personality disorders, particularly cluster B, borderline narcissism, histrionic. So, and to answer the question, do I practice it? Yeah, basically, but I don't advertise myself as such because it's a particular model. There's hundreds and hundreds of therapy models. And if people watched me without knowing what sort of therapy model I adhered to, people that knew of the 500 plus different, and these are just established models. These aren't just all the models that have been proposed. These are like the established, somewhat at least popular models that, a certain percentage of people adhere to. And if someone watched me, or any therapist for that matter, they would wonder if I was using, 300 out of 500 of the models because of how much overlap there is. So when it comes to mentalization-based therapy, it's really not that different from a certain brand of psychodynamic therapy or relational therapy or attachment-oriented therapy or brief dynamic therapy, or there's certain strains of humanistic therapy that would look very much like mentalization-based therapy. Basically what it is that it's a form of therapy developed by theorists who were very much and are very much in the world of treating people with borderline and other related disorders, in that the concept of mentalization is a broader term to our field that is characterized by being able to intuit or guess at what is going on in other people's minds and hearts. When my wife and I are having some tension or something, am I able to accurately, within a certain range, know what is in her mind, if we're interacting or not when we're interacting? And of course, I can't know, but taking a guess, especially as we interact, the body language and the nonverbals and even the verbals. And for people who have been through relational traumas and have experienced chaos or neglect or something, mistreatment, abuse, early in life, they can, not always, but they can have an impaired ability of mentalization because they were never given consistent examples to learn from, or they weren't interacted with enough, or they don't even know how they feel themselves, let alone how other people feel. So mentalization is something that's very important to assess for in therapy. Mentalization-based therapy focuses on helping the client develop that skill of mentalizing. And a version of this, which is right down the middle, contemporary psychodynamic therapy, involves using the relationship between the therapist and the client, and the client will believe they know what I'm thinking. Like if I have a borderline client, it's very common for them to absolutely know that I am trying to get rid of them, that I am making plans to terminate them because I just can't handle them. They're too much, or I just hate them, or something. And they're convinced. And I know in my heart that is not the case. It's quite the opposite. So they are not mentalizing accurately. They are not only not knowing what's going on in my heart and mind, even though I've told them, and even though all indications are saying that I'm absolutely there for them, by the sheer fact that I've been working with them for 5 years, and even though they have abused me emotionally, I have not changed my approach or my care towards them at all. If anything, it's just gotten more deep and more certain. And yet they still believe that I am at any moment going to reject them, because that's how it feels, because that's how it usually was when they were very young. So in the therapy office, I can help them to mentalize more accurately by one, and you'll hear me say this, I would never expect someone in that scenario to be able to understand what's really in my heart, because it's too hard. It's too much of a leap. The first thing that I can do, though, is have them question their assumption. And this is something that's in DBT. It's something that is in CBT to some extent, in ACT, in REBT, in Adlerian. This is, the questioning of your perspective or assumptions or narratives or cognitions or beliefs or schemas is all, again, so mentalization-based therapy doesn't invent new things, is the point. I'm not denigrating it at all. In fact, if I were to pick, 25 different theories that I wanted to bring with me to my, desert island, that would maybe be one of them. I'm not quite sure. But that's basically what it entails. All right, let's take a break. All right, back from the break. Listener Dervla from Ireland, she says, "Dear Dr. Honda, I am a 60-year-old woman living in Ireland. Having been a subscriber to your channel for years now, I have come to a greater understanding of what narcissism means and how it comes about. Neglect in early childhood is one of the recurring themes." Just chiming in, yeah, Dervla, you got it. Going on. "Because people in Ireland were ruled by the Catholic Church with an iron fist during the 1950s and 1960s, women were given no choice but to serve the needs of their husbands in every respect, including their sexual needs. This resulted in there being many, many families with siblings in double figures." So, because of the Catholic Church and the misogyny and sexism and control of women, lots of kids in every family, and even in the double figures. "One woman in my town had 21 surviving children. This level of procreation was often coupled with abject poverty, which the church ignored. The results of this was a huge slew of children who were deeply neglected and abused in some cases, due to mothers being overwhelmed and fathers being addicted to alcohol and often unemployed. Sadly, over the years of learning about narcissism from you, I reluctantly began to identify myself in some of the behaviors of narcissism, although I believe I may have been a lot worse when I was younger. It was a hard pill to swallow to think that I was narcissistic. But perhaps more importantly, I also began to recognize that many of my peers exhibited some of the characteristics of narcissism too. And it is my belief that within my age group and people in their 70s and 80s that it is almost an epidemic. I believe that this is yet another result of abuse perpetuated by the Catholic Church in Ireland, but not one that is recognized or spoken about. I'm just wondering if this is even possible, that a whole chunk of society from a certain era were subjected to neglect and abuse that has resulted in a vast group of adults within that society now presenting with narcissistic tendency or narcissism. End of email. Well, listener Dervla, that is very intelligent and self-aware question and email. The answer to that is, yeah, absolutely, as you are identifying. And this is something that often isn't talked about, right? That you can have an entire population experience some sort of trend that challenges attachment, interferes with attachment, that can result in a whole slew of children suffering from a variety of personality issues that get passed down, right? And what I would imagine, which I don't know and I haven't seen the research, is that if we define narcissism broadly, which I sometimes will do, in that you can have someone that is classically narcissistic. You could also have covert narcissism. You can also have a version of what we would probably just call severe avoidant attachment with pathological independence and maybe a dash of narcissism and self-centeredness and a grandiose sense of self-independence or something. Then we're going to catch a lot of people in that net in any society, but maybe in this age group in Ireland, we would capture a pretty big group. If a whole group of people were experiencing neglect, which often does happen when you have too many kids, it's something that people don't talk enough about. You know, it just makes sense. And there's a lot of variety here. You know, it's not like if you have 4 children, you can only love each child 1/4 the amount if you compared to if you just had 1 kid. That's not how those things work. Plus, children get love from a lot of people in their family, including older siblings, if things are going well. Plus, different age developmental stages require different amounts of love and attention and different kinds of love and attention, right? So, you know, you can have parents that can give an infant all the infant energy that they have, while also giving a 7-year-old all the 7-year-old energy that they have, and there's not a lot of overlap, so there's enough to give to both. But it stands to reason that if you have 21 children, that something's got to give. Now, again, if you have 21 kids, then by definition, there are at least some kids that are older teens, early 20s. And if you're still around, those older kids, and even kids as young as 12 can babysit and bond in a very profound way, in a mutually benefiting way. That can also be abused. When we talked about the was it the Duggars? Everything's blending together. Yeah, I think it would have been the Duggars, right? That in that family, they had that setup that it was always an older girl. It was never an older boy. The older girls in the family were formally identified as the primary caregiver for younger children. When the new child was born into the family, they would pick the next girl in line and say, okay, this infant is now your responsibility, that kind of thing. And I don't know the exact division of labor, but if you have that many kids in a family, the mother, there's no way she could possibly take care of everything, right? So things can pan out that way sometimes. But like you said, if you're also facing poverty and you have a father that has self-esteem issues and is drinking a lot because he feels shitty about himself, and he avoids going home because he feels like a failure, and his dad never came home, so he just considers that to be normal, maybe even being abusive, who knows. The mother, having been raised in a neglectful household of too many children, doesn't have much love to give, even if she just had one kid. You're going to have a whole swath of kids, whole generation of kids that are going to show signs of something, whether it's narcissism or avoiding attachment or general attachment coldness or attachment fear, even without abuse, right? So it's a very intelligent question. I'd never heard about that possible dynamic. And if any other people from Ireland, including famous Major Lyndon, for example, maybe they can chime in on this, email in. All right, let's read another email. All right, this next email is from Annual Anonymous Patron, and I'm just going to summarize her email. She is taking care of her brother, who is 55, and has been diagnosed with bipolar, schizophrenia, and borderline, and has a lot of issues, symptoms, but also can't function as an independent adult, and also refuses to comply with treatment and with her requests for him to take care of himself and be a good roommate, right? And she's asking, like, I'm under a lot of stress. I don't know what to do, and I'm worried about his mental health declining. I'm worried about something happening to me. No one will be there for him. I'm also concerned about the amount of conflict or tension or worry that I feel, or lack of him being on board with things. What sort of program is out there for people like this? Are there strategies for, to be more successful? Because, so what I'll say to this is that what you're experiencing is a very, very, very common experience, that you have someone who is having a lot of issues, and they need someone to take care of them. And they have a family member who steps up and does it. Without you, he would probably be in an institution, or he would be homeless, or he would be in prison because he would commit a crime, because he would not be able to keep a job, and so he would be desperate, and he might become drug addicted, and then things really go off the rails then. So for people in your position, you're taking care of someone that is struggling, but also isn't necessarily contributing, and isn't complying, isn't going. If he had cancer and he had a doctor's appointment, presumably he'd be willing to get ready to go to the appointment and get in the car. But some of these individuals, they won't take their meds, they won't clean themselves, they won't pick up after themselves, they won't listen when you say, "Can you please turn the TV down?" You weren't necessarily talking about that, but it can be hard. Plus, as you're right to worry about, like, well, if something happens to me, who's going to take care of him? Things could really go off the rails. And if you want to blame someone, blame the government, blame the voters who don't advocate for this thing or won't allow money to be allocated toward this. Because of course, if you actually are close to these cases, and because it's kind of rare, it doesn't happen very often, but it shouldn't be a burden on a family member. The family member should be there to some extent, right? We would expect family to care, but to be 24/7, 365, having to work with a resistant family member and taking care of them, it's too much. There should be help, maybe in-home nursing that's paid for by the government or insurance, or there should be institutions that are ethical and comfortable, and something that it's a win-win for everyone, So that's what should be provided. And then you would, one, not have to deal with it all yourself, but two, if something happened to you, right, there would be others that would be taking care of him. So, and presumably in that situation, if it was adequate care, there would be a greater chance of him rehabilitating or being able to maybe work a little bit, because they would have programs, like they would have the ability to get everyone together to do a project or something that was at their level of ability or tolerance level or something. Whereas for someone like you to do it, even though you're working all the time, like it's asking too much. So what I'll say is that it's the answer to your question is, I get your question, and of course your question deserves to be answered, but there's not a lot out there. Having said that, there are things, and it depends on your community. I would just start asking around. Just call various different psychiatric centers. Call your local DSHS, and it sometimes is just a matter of getting hold of that right person. Obviously Googling around. So, and there's probably national organizations you can call. National. I give money to it. Well, you patrons, actually, a portion of your pledge goes to the National Institute of Mental Health. Is that what it's called? I'm really bad with that kind of thing. I'll blame it on my dyslexia. But, the National Mental Health Organization. Anyway, you could call them, obviously. So, or maybe there's another podcast or YouTube channel that specializes in this kind of stuff, and you could write into them. I don't know, but I feel your pain. All right, this next email is from listener Sam. He says, "Hey, Dr. Honda, I discovered your channel this year, and you have changed my stance on a lot of things. I've had a negative opinion on trigger warnings, thinking that they probably don't help. My opinion on this was affirmed by a story on NPR about a woman who hated trigger warnings. She said that stories about suicide did not trigger her, but things like brotherly bonds and other little things in everyday life would. I feel like I act too harsh towards trigger warnings, and you use them frequently, so I'd like to hear your opinion on how they benefit. Thank you." End of email. Yeah, well, so trigger warning began to be used in response to actual PTSD triggering. If someone was raped and a college professor, without warning, shows a graphic depiction of someone being raped, like in a movie, like in Girl with the Dragon Tattoo or something, and just shows it to everyone, then it'll be uncomfortable for a lot of people, but it won't be triggering for them. But for some people, it'll be so triggering to them that it'll throw them into symptoms that could ruin their lives, possibly even leading to them being suicidal. Being having PTSD is a thing. It's not just being kind of uncomfortable. It can throw you into dissociation, into high distress, into fight or flight, adrenaline dumps that can last for months, if not, but in all likelihood, at least a couple weeks. So in an effort to raise awareness of this and to help presenters and organizations with their practices and to protect people, we, as a field in psychology, invented this practice called trigger warnings. Then it became used over time, and the general public would hear trigger warnings, but they wouldn't really know what it meant because it wasn't being explained. And even if it was, people, naturally don't understand trauma and PTSD. It's complicated. So it was unclear. And then some people started to invoke trigger warning language, claiming that they were being triggered in a class or something when they weren't actually being triggered. Or at the very least, the triggering was questionable at best. So this has been going on for a long time. And I actually developed guidelines. I had a whole episode on trigger warnings 10 years ago in 2015. And as a result of that episode, I published guidelines about trigger warnings in the hope that people would catch on to this. I published it on my website as a document that people could use, because I found that the media and even people in my field just weren't really understanding. Because, on one side you had people that were saying, hey, we need trigger warnings, and they were being valid. On the other hand, you had people that, conservative-minded people that were saying that people were using trigger warnings just to complain and to be weak, like, I don't like that political point of view, I'm triggered, that kind of thing. And it was being used as this way of shutting down the trigger warning conversation. Also, this NPR story that you're talking about is another nuance to this, which is that you can have someone who has PTSD or trauma reactivity, and they are triggered by very, very specific things. The story that you alluded to on NPR, I don't know the accuracy of this, but it doesn't surprise me that someone's like, I'm not triggered by suicide or depictions of rape. I am triggered by brotherly bonds and other little things that everyday life provides. So you obviously can't, or it's not reasonable to expect that before literally everything that could possibly trigger someone that we would say trigger warning. That's why when I provide a trigger warning, I also will often say it's individuals' responsibility to be aware of their triggers. Maybe not initially, but if you have trauma reactivity, it's really important that individuals investigate through therapy, through it with a specialist, their specific triggers. You could be triggered by a particular cologne. Is, a popular brand of cologne. Should that person not wear their cologne that they want to wear? No, that's anything can trigger someone. A man, just the presence of a man can trigger someone. Should someone not be allowed to be a man or not be allowed to leave the house? No. So there has to be a line there, right? But there are very common triggers that are, at the very least, it's uncommonly presented, and it's common enough as a trigger, and it's not hard to provide a trigger warning. So let me go over my guidelines that I developed. Again, I developed this 10 years ago. So this is a very old thing, and I feel like we've gotten nowhere in our, or maybe we've gotten a little somewhere in our society. But anyway, so there are 5 guidelines, 5 principles. 1, if a presenter is planning on exposing individuals to graphic depictions of something that's likely to be traumatizing, like childhood sexual abuse, sexual assault, war, stress, traumatic death, like suicide, homicide, or a car accident or something like that, then that individual or organization should adequately and reasonably inform the public, the people who are going to be exposed to the depiction, with enough time for individuals to contemplate the trigger and react, and without consequences such as embarrassment or loss of course credit or something like that. So, for example, a common scenario is a classroom, right? So you have 100 students in a college course, and you have a professor say that, say it's a film class, and they want to show scenes from The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And one of the scenes is the rape scene. And they want to talk about editing or lighting or acting or something. And the presenter should be aware, at being a responsible for professor, maybe trainings need to happen or something. Plus, I would hope that most people would know that a rape scene could be triggering for some people who have been raped, right? Now, not everyone who has been raped would be triggered by that. Plenty of people who have been raped don't have PTSD. And by triggering, I'm not saying it's not discomfort. Let me drill down on that. Well, I guess I already did. But there's a difference between, like if I was in a film class and I watched that scene, or even when I did watch that scene in Dragon Tattoo, as I often bring up that movie and that scene, it left an impression. There's another movie that me and Alberto talk about called Irreversible, which I'm guessing you haven't seen, and I don't recommend anyone see it. It has one of the worst, most accurate, most long-lasting static shots of a rape scene I've ever. It's horrific. It's debatable as to whether or not that should have ever been published, honestly. But these things are uncomfortable to watch, and they themselves can be traumatizing, right? So that should be considered. There are common things that are likely to traumatize people. Some people aren't accustomed to seeing violence and gore. So even that, even if you don't have a history or PTSD, like that should be considered, right? We shouldn't, like we all understand that if you showed a gory rated R movie to a bunch of fifth graders, that would leave a mark for some of the kids. Well, fifth graders aren't the only people on the planet that can be traumatized by a movie or a scene or something. Any adult can. Some people are accustomed to horror movies, and like my wife I'm not very accustomed to horror movies, but my wife is particularly not, and she could actually experience trauma reactivity if she were to be forced to watch. Sometimes we'll go to a movie and there will be a preview before the movie that will be of a horror movie, and it'll give her nightmares. It'll affect her, and she has ways of managing that. One, just not looking at the screen and covering her ears, but all those things should be considered because we don't want to harm people. That's the thing. So. But particularly if we're showing a graphic scene of rape or, killing someone or slitting someone's throat or assault or abduction or war stress or something or child abuse, most of us can intuit that some people in the audience might have specific PTSD about that. And then before the class even begins, you send out a trigger warning and you say, by the way, today we're going to be watching this thing, or next week we're going to be watching this thing. So if you think that's going to trigger you, then you can either not come to class, or you can come to class late, or you can not come for the middle portion or something like that. And then I also include in here that you need to provide enough time and without any consequences. So one of the things that some trigger warnings are provided is that they will do it in the middle of class, right? So you're teaching this class of 100 students, and the teacher will say, okay, well, trigger warning, there's going to be a scene here of rape. Well, it's really embarrassing for someone to stand up in the middle of class and walk out. Everyone knows, oh, that person was raped. That person has PTSD. You don't want to do that to someone. Plus, the vast majority of people would not stand up. They would, out of avoidance of embarrassment and being outed, they would just sit and endure it. So you have to give people enough advance. And it's not fucking hard, is the thing. This isn't a big deal. You just plan in advance. Usually these things are planned in advance. Like if you make a YouTube episode about something, now with YouTube it's different, right? Because people can turn stuff off right there. There's no embarrassment because they're not in public, right? So they can just, if I say trigger warning, by the way, and if I give enough time, someone could just stop the video, right? So that is all something to be considered. But anyway, so that's the first principle, is that if a presenter is planning on exposing people to graphic depictions of something that is commonly traumatic, then they need to do so well in advance so that the person can avoid being embarrassed or being, and the other thing is that there can't be a consequence. Like you can't have questions on the test related to that clip because someone might sit out. All right. Number 2. If an individual is aware, so this is requiring the individual with trauma. So the trigger warning guidelines that I have are not just on presenters. It's also on the individual with trauma, because that person has responsibilities too. If an individual is aware that they can become triggered by something relatively uncommon, like brotherly love, for example, or fire trucks or loud noises or a particular cologne, then that individual is encouraged to advocate for themselves by informing presenters or other people, or taking other reasonable measures to avoid being triggered. And if a presenter has been informed, then that presenter should compassionately and reasonably accommodate that individual, because it's the moral and just thing to do. So that's a responsibility on both parties, right? But the first part of that is that if an individual is aware that they have a trigger that is too specific for any presenter to predict, then that individual is encouraged to advocate for themselves by informing the presenter and saying, hey, by the way, that thing that's coming up, I think I'm going to be triggered by that, or that thing did trigger me. So if we could avoid doing that in the future, and it should be done, as in a reasonable way. You don't attack the presenter, because how would they know? And then if you're informed that as a presenter, then you should accommodate that, because it's the moral and just thing to do. And it shouldn't be all busted up, and there shouldn't be lawsuits necessarily, and there shouldn't be cancellations or informing of the boss or going on Twitter. It's just a conversation, hope in the best case scenario, between individual and presenter, and everything gets worked out. Okay. Number 3, aside from trauma triggers, if an individual feels uncomfortable with a presentation, like a lecture on sexism, then the individual is free to communicate that to the presenter. However, the individual is encouraged to avoid using the term trigger, because that's a word we use for trauma, PTSD specifically, since overusage of the word trigger potentially undermines the movement to protect individuals suffering from PTSD and other trauma-related conditions. So again, aside from people with PTSD and the presenters, the general public has a responsibility in this as well, that if they feel uncomfortable, and if they don't know if this discomfort is trauma-related, seeking professional help is important. But unless you know that it's PTSD, or you strongly suspect that it has to do with mental illness being triggered by material that a presenter is presenting, then these people should not be using trigger or trigger warning or I was triggered. They should be using the term uncomfortable. There's nothing wrong with being uncomfortable or using that term. If I was uncomfortable with something and I didn't want to have to deal with it, and I thought there was another way to teach the point that the professor or the presenter was trying to put across, then I would say, hey, that topic is a little loaded, or it's a little tough to watch, or a little tough to talk about, and it's gonna cause me distress or discomfort. I'm not triggered. I don't have trauma around this in the PTSD. That's the other thing, we have to define trauma, right? But we want to be very careful with our language when it comes to this. And if I, as a presenter, heard from a student or someone, an attendee, that a topic was making them uncomfortable but not triggered, then, I would absolutely take into consideration, because most presenters don't want to bother people in the audience. So all that should also be a regular conversation that doesn't require much controversy. Number 4, if an individual is suffering from a trauma-related condition, like PTSD, dissociation, or even substance use to some extent, they are encouraged to engage in trauma recovery from a competent trauma therapist, since this will reduce or eliminate suffering and the need for trigger warnings altogether. Okay. Now, of course, there's privilege involved in that, but that's a principle, because one of the things that you will hear in the discourse around trigger warnings is, okay, we'll accommodate those who have trauma, and we will accommodate the trigger warning. Are these individuals actually taking measures to help themselves with the PTSD within reason, so that they're not overly burdening the presenters and society with their trauma unnecessarily? Now, it takes a long time to recover from PTSD, and it's also understandable when someone wants to avoid treatment, because it involves a fair amount of facing of one's traumas. So, it's no shame here, but it's another responsibility that everyone participates in. Number 5, this is the last one. Unqualified individuals in the media should refrain from providing uneducated commentary on the topic of trigger warnings and trauma-related conditions, because they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. And when they talk about this, they might further stigmatize trauma-related conditions and hamper efforts to reduce suffering, creating a hostile environment for traumatized individuals, and potentially leading to triggered symptoms for traumatized individuals, such as depression, anxiety, suicide, fearful rage, and drug abuse. However, individuals in the media are encouraged to comment on clear abuses of the term trigger warning, while also advocating for the term's valid uses. Okay. So this last principle was toward the media, and I suppose towards people on Twitter or something, of, before you talk about trigger warnings, ask yourself, are you an expert? Because this does require expertise. the general public and people in the media apparently are not in a position to intelligently talk about this, because it's rare that it's intelligently talked about this. And I was bitching about this in 2015 or, well before 2015, because it got to such a point that I made an episode about it in 2015. So, if I think about it, maybe it's a little better now, because the overall upsetness around the term isn't as fresh. But I wouldn't say that people are intelligent as a society. I wouldn't say that we're intelligent about this. I do hear people using trigger warning more often, but I often find that people don't know why. They have this very surface level understanding. It's just like, oh, I'm about to. It's sort of like the bullshit on TikTok. Like, you can't say suicide or masturbation, apparently, or kill or murder. Like people on TikTok or people in society, they think they've reduced it down to just these certain words that they think are triggering or something. And so just saying rape, apparently they think they have to not say that word, or they'll say trigger warning, that person was raped. That's not a trigger for people. For people who have rape trauma, just acknowledging the fact that rape exists is not likely to trigger someone. It's depicting it. It's having people in your audience be exposed to such a degree that they can't help but to have their own memories come to the fore. Acknowledging rape or murder or masturbation or sexual abuse or suicide, just saying the fucking word doesn't typically trigger people. And if it did, I would actually put them in that category of, then you might want to seriously limit your media. It's sort of like with the cologne situation. Until that is habituated to in treatment, in trauma specialized therapy, then I might if it was particularly bad, then I might recommend that person be very careful as to where they go in public, which sucks. But what else is that person supposed to do? Walk around with a big sign in their head saying, if you have this cologne, steer clear of me. I mean, maybe, each to their own, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But, it's unreasonable to think that someone would do that. It's unreasonable to think that someone would look at a sign like that and understand what's happening. And that's the sucky thing about trauma, right? Now, the thing is most people with PTSD are not self-entitled people who demand things. If anything, it's the opposite. Most people with PTSD do not advocate for themselves nearly as much as they deserve to. So it's not like people with PTSD are walking around demanding everyone do everything for them. It's almost always the opposite, the shame, the stigma. So if we give the message of trigger warnings and entitlement to the general public, at least for the people with actual PTSD, we want them to feel more entitled because they deserve to be more entitled. The problem is that people who are merely uncomfortable with the topic are co-opting the term as an effort of power in the same way that people will co-opt words like OCD or gaslighting or trauma bonding or other, trauma bonding is not an example, but gaslighting is, that people don't like to be lied to or deceived or tricked, and they co-opt gaslighting, which is a severe aspect of actual ongoing abuse, often in an intimate partner relationship. They will co-opt the word gaslighting because they want to fight back against deception or what they believe to be trickery from someone else. And no, don't. Just stick to the word that the definition of, which is stop lying to me or stop deceiving me or stop telling me what I feel. That's not how I feel. Just stand on the English language as it is. Don't co-opt other things. Don't dilute. That's the problem, is that people would hear people decrying trigger warning or I'm triggered when they weren't actually being triggered. If anything, in my anecdotal experience, at least 10 years ago, most of the people saying that they were triggered didn't. If I heard someone saying publicly, I am being triggered, most likely they did not have PTSD. Again, because people with PTSD tend to be very self-shamed and don't speak up. Now, it's just a generalization, but so, in my principles here, the main principle is if you're a presenter and you're going to present something that might be triggering, then give a trigger warning well in advance, preferably within 24 hours. And if someone took action to protect themselves, there's no consequence, right? That's the main principle. Aside from that, other principles that I have are, hey, people, stop using trigger if you don't know what it means or you don't have PTSD, or some form of PTSD or some related thing, right? Like dissociation. And if people really understood the original meaning of trigger warning that psychology invented and advocated for, no one would have a problem with it. But that's not what's talked about in the media. It's not what's talked about in society. And it's really upsetting, and it keeps people who are harmed silent and shamed and harmed and afraid for good reasons, right? If you have, even if you have just the run-of-the-mill kinds of traumas, like you were raped and a graphic depiction of rape triggers you, you can't trust society because we're not intelligent enough as a group to figure the fuck out what's happening and to sift through all the bullshit on Twitter and have a general cultural policy of understanding PTSD and providing trigger warnings for people. It's just absurd, So when you ask me this question, Sam, what you are expressing is you are a product of the bullshittery that's online. It makes me angry, but I'm also not surprised. Most people have your point of view that trigger warnings are silly and stupid, and that it's the coddling of America, and that it's some sort of stupid liberal agenda or some lady thing or something. And it simply is not. So, and we could talk about the patriarchy and how that general cultural element is there to shame all emotions, particularly what's considered woman emotions. Or for whatever reason, trauma is considered a woman thing. It's not. And so even when it's in an ambiguous zone, any sort of mention of trigger warning instantly gets labeled as histrionic and hysterical by the patriarchy. So, there's a lot of that. I mean, the fact that anyone would have an opinion about trigger warning is just kind of weird, right? Like, what's it to you? So I hope, Sam, that I've changed your mind about this as well. Let me know if I have or I have not. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.